Thanks, everyone. So I don't really consider myself an economist now, and if people try to call me that, I'm a little embarrassed. But nonetheless, that's where I come from. And everyone's going to be asked to fill out this form with field you identify with. So I guess I have to fit into there. So I'm going to try to branch out from some pretty classical things that economists think about to talk about how we might address those types of problems in the context of a plural frame. So let me start from the micro and then zoom out to the macro and then eventually the meta. It's a very standard problem in economics, which inspired a lot of my work, is called mechanism design. The basic idea here is you've got a bunch of selfish people pursuing their interests. How do you change the environment so that they work towards a common good? And that's not quite the frame that plurality takes, right? In plurality, there aren't really these atomistic, selfish individuals. There are these people who are at the intersection of a variety of different social groups, and their motives are driven by the motives of those social groups. And so the problem is less one of aligning individuals with the common good and more one of when you have people who are socially distant from each other and that social distance leads them to come into conflict, how do you create sort of a facilitation or mechanisms that both allow them to maintain those social differences? That's sort of the corresponding version of allowing people freedom within the individualistic frame, and at the same time provide them a reason to cooperate with each other, which is kind of the bridging thing that Luke was just talking about. And I think we're just starting to explore what a formalism for writing down that problem might look like. I think it involves concepts like subsidiarity instead of the standard sort of monotonicity conditions that exist in mechanism design. I think it involves sort of self-identification of affiliations and ties by collections of people rather than revelations of individual preferences by individuals. But I think this is one of the really core concepts. If you want to start producing things that are in the spirit of quadratic voting or whatever, but that are relevant for a pluralistic world, you need a way to write down these plural versions of these mechanism design problems. Okay, let me get one level away from just fundamental theory to something that's a little bit more applied. So there's two mechanisms that I've been quite involved in developing for rethinking property. And they're in some ways polar opposites of each other, though they share one really important property. So one of these is soul-bound tokens. These are, to a first approximation, property that can't be transferred. To a second approximation, they're property that's transferred only with the consent of a community that you're a part of, a personalized community that you're a part of. So these don't have a lot of the problems that a private property ownership of an NFT would have. They don't have speculation. They don't have a lot of these things that people worry about with NFTs. There's another opposite extreme thing, however, that also doesn't have speculation, which is called a Harburger token. This is one where you self-assess a price, you pay a tax based on that price, and anyone can buy it from you at the self-assessed price. So the first one can't be transferred. It's hyper non-marketized. And the second one is more marketized than private property is, right? It's you have to transfer it. It's constantly being transferred, right? So, but both of them share the feature that ownership is not really individual, it's social in some sense, and the feature that they don't encourage speculation. In the first case, because you can't transfer it, and so therefore you can't benefit from speculation. In the second case, because you're paying a tax on the value that's getting speculated on, so it offsets your incentive to want the thing to appreciate. And so it seems to me that there's some kind of a spectrum here, and maybe that's, those are not the only two endpoints. Maybe there's other things floating around, but it seems to me there's actually a whole space of plural, property designs that bridge between these and that have properties that are maybe closer in feeling to private property, but kind of strictly dominate them in terms of a lot of the things that we'd want. And that may be a solution to getting past some of the boundaries to adoption of both of these two possibilities. And maybe could relate to various pre-Western colonial property practices that existed in a variety of societies. A third question is getting a little bit more to the macro level. So if you believe the arguments around quadratic funding, if you believe the notion that lots of things are kind of plural or network or public goods or whatever, and should not be funded primarily by private profit-seeking things, but by some kind of collective support for provision of a common good, then your first instinct is, oh, well, we should get towards a world where governments are providing a bunch of matching funds to things like Kevin's downtown stimulus, and that's how we should be providing lots of support. Maybe we should be running industrial policy, for example, not by having government gives grants to winners, but there's some democratic process of allocating funds across different things. So that sounds appealing, and I'm pretty confident that if you wrote it down in the right way, an economic model would say that's a superior way to run an economic system. But it immediately leads to the question of, so you have a bunch of different countries, they're all doing this. What does a trade agreement look like? Current liberal trade order is we sign an agreement, we knock down all of our subsidies, everyone's left to the capitalist system. And that's kind of what's it called? Cutting off your foot to spite your toes or whatever. It's like you're destroying the very foundation of potentially increasing returns phenomena so that nobody gets unfair advantage from it, right? The natural alternative is maybe something more like a Marshall Fund, where countries agree to fund cross-cutting infrastructure that benefits collaborations across those countries, and to both contribute to a fund for that, rather than to knock down their subsidies within country. And I think that's totally fascinating, and what kind of a macroeconomic international system would look that was built on plural principles rather than on neoliberal principles, I think is really interesting. And then finally, to the meta level, my aspiration for this community is that we become something kind of like a professional association. We become a, like a kind of an equivalent of the American Economic Association or ACM, that we have journals, that we have prizes, that we have fun, all the things that make it possible for those organizations to have kind of power and to empower young people to have a career in that area. But we don't want to do it in the ways that we think suck, that's the whole point, right? We want to do something like the same function in a way that is consistent with our principles and shows the world better ways of doing things and so forth. There's all kinds of interesting tensions there between personalizing things, but also wanting to create common knowledge, bridging, but also creating subfields so people can, et cetera. They're the bread and butter of these plural things. And I hope will be a community that shows and not just tells the world about those technologies. So I hope some of you will consider attending tomorrow unconference session I'm going to do on plural infrastructure for the Plurality Institute. Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for being here. It's such an honor.